Welcome to Playing with Assessment Discourse. I'm Sharon Murphy. The quasi-official world of educational assessment came knocking on my door when I was in first grade. There was no kindergarten then. Sister Philippa, the principal of my school, St. Edward's Academy, took me to the music room, the only room available, to get me to read for her. The stakes, whether I should stay in first grade or be promoted prematurely to second grade. The text I don't recall, but I believe it was from the government-approved reading series. Guessing now, it was probably from the first book of the second grade readers. What do I remember about the assessment? That I miscued on the word splash. I was promoted, despite the miscue on the word splash. What does a story about my first remembered encounter with educational assessment tell me? And how do I go from there to a discussion of playing with assessment discourse, the topic of my talk today? I think that my experience with assessment highlights that all assessment is about perspective. From the perspective of the adults, my assessment was a success as it resulted in my early promotion to second grade. But my memories are about the miscue splash, the likely trepidation I felt in being assessed by the principal, and the unusualness of the music room context. Over the past decades of my involvement with educational assessment, I have found perspective dominates the field of assessment, and that in the field of assessment, perspectives are largely polarized, entrenched, and sometimes inherently contradictory. Historically, the field of psychology, with its desire to be seen as a science, has been the dominant discourse in education. Alternatively, critique of assessment is typically situated in critical theory, or theories of cultural capital, or in philosophy. Often, implicitly or explicitly, these histories valorize medical assessment because of a false understanding of its precision, or they demonize it because of its technical, instrumental, and non-humanistic leanings. Yet one only need to look at Paget's study of mistakes made in the practice of medicine, as opposed to the conduct of medical experiments, to rethink both positions, because medicine, like assessment, is a human practice. So how do I get to playing with assessment discourse from such a contextualization? Well, for some years now, I have seen the field of educational assessment and its practitioners as being stuck. One way to move a field forward, if we want to borrow from Thomas Kuhn's observations about the structure of scientific revolutions, is to introduce something new. Another, given the literature on creativity, is to play. So in this talk, I'm proposing to do just that, to play with a couple of ideas. The intent is not to generate something concrete that can be held out and utilized immediately. Rather, the intent is to push thinking, to loosen it up, to take muscles that have learned to move in one direction and make them a little more limber in the hopes that new movements and ideas can be generated. My point of departure for this exercise is design. Underpinning all educational assessment is the issue of design. It should be noted that test and measurement theorists themselves acknowledge that the field of assessment design is under-theorized. Today, in this Playing with this Discourse session, I will borrow from structural engineering, a discipline focused on design, to imagine how language from structural design principles might unearth some of our assumptions when we think about assessment, and potentially lead to new forms of thinking. And yes, I did say structural engineering. Ideas of structural engineering captivated me when, some years ago, I heard someone interviewed on CBC radio on the program Ideas. The topic was why buildings fall down, and either Matthias Levy or Mario Salvadori, authors of a book by the same title, spoke. I was captivated and subsequently went out and bought both Why Buildings Fall Down as well as Why Buildings Stand Up. In reading these texts, I could see many ways to think about the structure of assessment. Today, I'm going to talk about just a few. According to Levy and Salvatore, structural redundancy refers to that aspect of a structure which permits loads to be carried in more than one way through more than one path in the structure. Let's have a look at what that means in architecture. I'm going to use one of Levy and Salvatore's examples, the Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Missouri. In the case of the Kemper Arena, the roof collapsed during a windy, rainy storm. Investigations revealed that each of the hangars in the roof contained 4 bolts. These bolts have been stressed over the years by repeated wind, but on the night in question, the stress load of wind combined with the stress load of water pooling on the roof was sufficient to break a single bolt in the hangar. The other bolts couldn't carry the additional load, so they failed. And then the process of a bolt breaking and the load being transferred to other bolts was repeated across the hangars and the roof structure. The result was the collapse of the structure. There was not sufficient structural redundancy designed into the roof structure to carry the load and provide backup should any one element fail. Now, let's take a look at the idea of loads and structural redundancy and think about what they evoke in relation to assessment. 3 questions come to mind. What loads must be carried in an assessment? How do different assessments carry the loads? And what happens when some unanticipated factors shift the anticipated loads? And what might this say about how assessment should be shaped and indeed interpreted? To start the discussion, one might well ask, what is the load that any assessment must carry? Once we ask that question, we discover that assessments, regardless of type, must carry many different loads. In other words, the things that go together to make up that assessment all can produce different stresses on the assessment structure as a structure. As such, they impact the structure's ability to optimally perform, to provide a characterization of knowing within the specific confines of that structure. Here are some examples of the kinds of loads that research tells us are related to the human interaction of educational assessment. Idea generation. The thing about the thinking and the ideas of human beings is that they may or may not conform to everyone else's. Ideas represented in assessment are lived examples of the individual's thinking and knowing in relation to the collective. So questions that might well be asked of assessments are, what kind of redundancies are built into the structure of assessment to allow for the tensions created by individualism? And at what point is the individualism so strong that it is untenable? Does the assessment make room for a generative individual as opposed to one that can only reproduce? Should it? How does the assessment structure account for the defensibility of individualistic thinking? Technical skills. Typically, assessments implicitly or explicitly involve a suite of technical skills. These are enabling conventions, at least as defined or accrued by the collective. An example of a technical skill could be keyboarding. These skills are cultural artifacts in that embedded in them is an understanding of efficiency and effectiveness arising from the practices in that field. If an aspect of technique or specific technique is not as strong as others, what impact does this have on the structural load of the assessment? Does the assessment collapse under its load? Organizational skills. Organization is about a sense of order. Physically, it might be a student's binder, tabbed and neat, or perhaps with dog-eared, crumpled papers. Mentally, it might be the reader whose priorities are different than either those of the author or education system, a reader who constantly meanders down tangential pathways. How does the assessment system account for the stresses of the crumpler or meanderer? Affective and relational sensibilities. Affective and relational sensibilities both involve relationships with people, texts, and ideas. These sensibilities have the power to propel, repel, and let one motor along in neutral, or even let one be swayed by the who as opposed to the what in an assessment. How do assessment structures build in structural redundancies so that affective and relational sensibilities do not overpower the structure? Or might the structures deliberately be built to respond to these sensibilities? Strategies and wisdom. Strategies and wisdom operate in a twofold manner. Strategies are really options for pursuing a particular route within the discourse of the field or cultural practice at play. For example, I often provide beginning graduate students with advice on strategies to use in setting up a standard essay. Wisdom is developing an understanding, both through engagement and through listening to advice on which practices operate best in which circumstances, by weighing individual relative issues. In the example of my providing strategy advice to graduate students on writing, for instance, wisdom can be manifested in setting aside strategies. How do assessment structures make room for strategicality and account for wisdom? Fundamentally, we have to ask what kinds of redundancies, repetitive elements, or perhaps other design features are built into the structure to offset different loads. Of course, implicit in such a position is that these loads, or even unspecified loads, for example, I haven't discussed aesthetic loads, these loads matter. So, to wrap up, I hope you will agree that borrowing from structural engineering kind of pushes away at assessment concepts. There are many other structural engineering concepts that could help us think about assessment. That is and is not the point of my talk today. Rather, in some senses, I want to borrow from the contemporary philosopher Alain de Botton, who argues that the premise of architecture is that we are, for better or for worse, different people in different places. I hope that my attempt to play with structural engineering ideas in relation to assessment design began for some of you the work of imagining new kinds of assessment places for education.